Welcome back. You're watching World Talks, and I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. EU leaders plan a trip to Beijing in July for a summit with Xi Jinping, according to information provided by South China Morning Post. Reportedly, no date has yet been confirmed with the Chinese side, as travel plan indicates serious effort to re-engage with China amid collapsed relationship with the US. In the meantime, Polish Deputy Minister of Finance said in the interview with TVP World, I quote, "If there is to be much more imports from China and massive imports from China because America is closing, that it is a problem for us." How is the EU going to approach the subject of this delicate balance between protecting its own interest and aligning with the global market dynamics? Now, this is a question for my next guest, Jan Michałek, Professor of Economic Sciences at the University of Warsaw. Professor, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, I would say, first of all, I do hope that the sign sent by President Trump that the tariffs are paused means a beginning of the real negotiations between the EU and US. We have to remember that already in 2013 till 2017, we have been having ongoing negotiations on so-called TTIP, which means Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And they were almost closed. And this was the idea of having a free trade area on the majority of the goods, and then having a much more intensive trade between EU and the United States. So I hope this will be a great occasion to maybe not restart from the beginning, but to try to go in this direction first.
Since we're on that subject, do you think that Europe has already a plan in motion as to how convince the US administration to possibly lower the tariffs, or perhaps some like for like, something for something that you can get from the other side?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. We have seen that Europe had already planned how Europe could retaliate against high tariffs by the US.
So that's retaliation. What about negotiation?
Okay. But the retaliation means that we have some arguments, I don't want to say weapons, to discuss. Because if only one side says we have the power and the other side says we have nothing, so this is not a good situation. So I would say, of course, there should be some arguments against retaliation, but strong arguments in favor of having a more liberal trade. So if it happens like this, then of course there is a chance that at least some part of the, I would say, external pressure will be lowered down. On the other hand, I also believe that there is a first, I would say, wave of the protection, in this sense that we have seen already during the first President Trump presidency that the tariffs have been increased, and then slowly, step by step, both sides agreed to lower them slightly and to manage to continue international trade. And I hope this will happen
sooner than later, considering last week and the chaos that ensued.
I'm not sure what is the bargaining power of the EU, to which extent the EU can be convincing towards the China.
So this is the Europe-US front when it comes to the tariffs, but we have that planned meeting. We have the plans emerging for the EU leaders to travel to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping. What are the expectations? Because we see some sort of a movement when it comes to the EU-China front.
Yeah, I mean, the expectations are, of course, motivated mostly by the threat which you said. I mean, if really the US market is totally closed and tariffs of 125 means that they are absolutely prohibitive. So it means that some part of the Chinese export will be converted to the other countries, including, of course, the European Union. But the expectations, I hope, is that there is a room for, I would say, a sort of cooperation. In this sense, on the one hand, the EU can try to convince China to have the agreement or start the negotiations with US, limiting the size of export. On the other hand, I also hope that in the longer run, there is a room for I would say, maybe not fully free trade, but a liberalization of trade between China and the EU. We have seen that EU diplomacy has switched from multilateral front to bilateral front. Mm-hmm. We already see that EU had signed the agreements with the Latin American countries. It has signed with Japan. It has signed with is signing with Vietnam.
Europe is looking for avenues of
it's looking
diversifying the portfolio, so to speak.
Yes, diversifying the portfolio. And I hope that this sort of direction will also be an incentive to the US, that seeing that there are the alternatives to the US market. And therefore, it should, I would say, convince the US president to be more flexible in not destructing, if I may say, the world liberal trade. Of course, we know that the main argument for the pause in the US tariffs was not the external pressure, but the internal pressure. I mean, the pressure from the financial market. But
surprise, surprise.
Surprise, surprise. Yeah. But I hope that this sign or this pressure was sufficiently strong to convince President Trump that there is that he should take into account also the existing trade flows, the existing global value chains, the existing connections between the countries, and the interest of the U.S. I would say producer. What we have seen that, if I may say so, even Elon Musk is trying to convince President Trump that having a very high tariff is not a good idea.
Let's pull back from the US and try and focus more on our region. We had Mr. Paweł Karbownik, Polish Deputy Minister of Finance, on TVP World yesterday. So let's listen to what he had to say, because I would like to know your commentary on it.
I think the fundamental issue is that there is a problem with trading system globally. And
I think Donald Trump thinks so as well.
And this problem has been there for many years, and this is also the assessment of the Europeans, which is why we've been discussing with the Chinese for over a decade to basically address the issue of overcapacity. I remember when Prime Minister Tusk was still president of the European Council, we visited China many times and discussed with President Xi to address the overcapacity in steel and aluminium back then. It was 10 years ago. Now we have Chinese overcapacity in many more sectors, and certainly there is a growing problem. Back then, President Xi promised to address this issue. It's not been addressed, so I don't think we should be surprised that some governments are reacting in a more aggressive manner, because after all, if we want to trade, it has to be a fair trade. Only that makes sense, and there are doubts whether the Chinese exports are not subsidized.
And to subsidize what's just been said, Minister Karbownik also said if there's to be much more imports from China and massive imports from China because America is closing, that it is a problem for us. In what sense would this be a problem for us?
Okay, you asked me to make some comments, so let me do it. I am not sure whether we have the clear idea what fair trade is, because usually we speak either about the liberal trade when the restrictions are limited, and then there is a theory saying what are the benefits from liberal trade. And this trade was organized in this sense that we had the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, we have the World Trade Organization, we have some rules regarding the tariffs, and this is one thing. Fair trade, if it is treated that it must be a trade balance between every country, this is something, I would say, not in line with the real ideas of benefits from international trade. So I'm not contesting that large imbalances are good or bad. I'm saying that we have to be very careful in interpreting those words. This is the first thing. Then the second thing is of overcapacity. Overcapacity, I do understand. It means that the production and export possibilities of Chinese economies are quite big, and this is not surprising. The problem is only if it is done with huge domestic subsidies. And then, of course, this is the, I would say, real question, to which extent the domestic industries are really subsidized. And of course, this is a room for the introducing the protective measures, but based on real evidence, what is the level of subsidization or what is the real threat to the domestic industry. There are some instruments, there are countervailing duties, there are anti-dumping duties and other instruments like carbon taxes, which can prevent the massive inflow of, I would say, unfair trade from the Chinese side. But in my opinion, it should be rather in the framework of standard, I would say, rules, and not based on the assumption that because there is a trade deficit, we should completely close down the trade with China or some other countries, as presumably it is, I would say, planned by the US administration, or was planned, let's say.
So we know that, for instance, there's been meetings in Central Asia. We've heard about Uzbekistan, but there's a meeting in Hanoi in Vietnam.
Yeah.
How do you think this is going to change the dynamic, and especially that Vietnam has one of the largest tariffs when it comes to the U.S. package?
Yeah, of course, it seems that the Vietnam is a very promising market. On the one hand, because the level of protection is quite high. On the other hand, because it is a very dynamic economy. So I would say that, in my opinion, the EU Commission is clearly changing the priorities from multilateral to bilateral relationships. And here there is quite a long list of the countries with which the EU could have the much better relationship. I mean, in terms of starting with Vietnam, but then there is Malaysia, then there is Thailand, there is also, I would say, we should not neglect it, India, which is a very huge country, which has a very large potential, which will probably become sooner or later one of the important trade players. So I would say there is a room for having the reasonable liberalizing trade agreement with those countries. And I must say, I mean, it's a perception of trade economists that competition from the external world is doing well for the domestic economy. Closing the economy is not a remedy. I mean, it is not that if we had closed the economy during the PRL, we had the flourishing economy. No, on the contrary. If the, I don't know, North Korea is completely closed, it is not a great success of this economy. So being open is one of the, I would say, big achievements of the economic transition in Poland and majority of the European countries.
And
So
we will have to stay with that thought,
Okay.
and hopefully we'll be able to continue this discussion next time. Thank you so much, Jan Michałek, Professor of Economic Sciences at the University of Warsaw. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
And so this would be all for now here on World Talks, but please do stay tuned. We're back in just a moment with more interviews, features, and news for you to enjoy.